B-17 Flying Fortress Her did. On Valentine's Day 1944, a crew of 10 US airmen took off in a Boeing B-17G Flying Fortress nicknamed Her did to bomb some rail yards in Verona, Italy. They struggled to locate the target due to severe fog. The 4-engine heavy bomber was struck by enemy fire multiple times while flying over the target area, causing its tail guns to jam and 2 of its engines to burst into flames. After realizing that the plane was struggling from the outliers of its formation and in a severely disadvantaged position, the enemy fire only continued. Even after the aircraft began to fail, its crew fought fearlessly against the enemy, shooting down several planes in the process. Unfortunately, they failed to reach the runway where they planned to make an emergency landing. After learning that the B-17 was too heavy for the runway, the crew began dumping as much extra weight as they possibly could. While they were doing so, a 3rd engine exploded, giving the pilot no choice but to ditch the bomber into the sea, roughly 300 feet off the coast of Calvi, France. By then, 3 crew members had been killed in combat and went down with the plane. Another crew member was seriously wounded, while 2 other men sustained light injuries. Luckily for the surviving airmen, the aircraft floated long enough for them to escape and board life rafts. Today, the Her did remains at the bottom of the sea. Its wings are mostly intact and the engines are visible, despite the damage they incurred when the aircraft was shot down. The cockpit's also in surprisingly good condition and still contains its 2 metal seats and most of its instrumentation. Most of the propeller blades have been removed, and the plane's nose was destroyed upon impact. 8. Omis Military Base. The infamous Eastern Bloc Treaty known as the Warsaw Pact was officially disbanded toward the end of the Cold War in 1991, 36 years after it went into effect. By then, many of its signatory countries had already started to downsize their militaries. Included among them was Czechoslovakia, which continually reduced the size of its army from 1989 until 1993, when the country separated into modern-day Slovakia and the Czech Republic. At its peak, the Czechoslovak People's Army had 200,000 members, which was an extraordinarily high number for a country of just 15 million people. Consequently, a lot of bases were abandoned during the downsizing period that came during the fall of the Iron Curtain. One of these former military sites, located in the Czech village of Omis, is home to a multitude of deserted vehicles that are in surprisingly good shape for their age. Footage captured by an urban explorer who goes by the YouTube handle Survival Fox shows at least 2 Soviet-made UAZ-452 vans. Designed in the late 1960s, the model is reportedly still being used by the Russian military today. The video includes a Tatra 805 military truck, which was widely used by the Czechoslovak People's Army, as well as a late 1950s BRDM-2 armored vehicle, which Russia's been using in its Ukraine invasion. It's telling to realize that while these Soviet-era relics represent a step back in time to the Cold War, which was marked by a distinct lack of physical combat, they're also an active fixture of modern warfare. 7. The Malberg Barn. Located in western Germany, roughly halfway between Frankfurt and Cologne, the town of Bad Ems is home to around 9,000 residents. Since the 1870s, its economy's been largely based on tourism as a spa resort destination. The town's also famous for its abandoned funicular, known as the Malberg Barn. Built in the late 19th century, the cable railway was implemented as a way for visitors to reach a mountaintop hotel. It was the only easy way for people to get to the hotel. The funicular transported its riders 1,148 feet from the bottom of the hill to the property. Running along a 54.5% incline, it was considered Germany's steepest vehicle of its kind. Like most funiculars, the Malberg Barn traveled at a pace that could be most politely described as leisurely, peaking at 4.3 miles per hour, until a 1963 upgrade brought up its maximum speed to 7.4 miles per hour. Also, like most funiculars, the system worked by counterbalancing 2 vehicles that ran in opposite directions. To keep it running smoothly, its operators at the top loaded up the passengers and added water to a special compartment to bring the car to a specific weight. Gravity did the rest of the work, pulling the top carriage downhill and pulling the bottom vehicle up. The funicular fell into decline in 1951 after the 25-year leasing contract with the Mountaintop Hotel expired. Ownership was passed along to the city, which unfortunately couldn't afford to keep the system running safely. It was closed permanently in 1979. Today, the carriages remain at the stations, and the site is considered an official monument despite its neglected state. Would you like to visit this abandoned site? Tell us in the comments and hit subscribe while you're at it. 6. Train caboose in the Canadian woods. Perched oddly on a hill in an unspecified part of the Canadian woods, which means it could be almost anywhere in Canada, there's a faded red 1940s era train caboose that looks like it randomly plopped down out of the sky one day with no rhyme or reason for where it ended up. In a YouTube video published by Abandoned Urbex Canada in early 2022, the host explains that the caboose has been at its current location since the 1980s. It was a birthday gift from the former property owner's sons, who spent $20,000 on the caboose to give their father what any rail enthusiast would consider the surprise of a lifetime. To get the caboose to its current location, the sons had a custom track built at the site. Using 2 large hired cranes, they lifted the train car and set it in place. As the Abandoned Urbex Canada video points out, they probably also had to cut down trees to create a clearing for the caboose. Over the last 30 to 40 years since, it appears as though nature has started to reclaim the site. The landowner's home was demolished after he passed away in 2004, but the train remains at the property to this day. In fact, that's where his ashes are scattered. The car is in surprisingly good condition for its age, although its interior furnishings are sparse to say the least. Actually, the car appears mostly empty, minus some seating, counter space, and cabinetry that remains affixed to the floor and walls. 5. Tanks in Antarctica. For a 3-year period starting in 1939, the US Navy, State Department, Treasury, and Department of the Interior jointly sponsored the United States Antarctic Service Expedition. Led by the famed explorer Admiral Richard Byrd, a team of 59 researchers stayed at 2 separate bases known simply as East and West. Their equipment, which was transported to Antarctica by ship, included the only tanks to ever serve on the continent. As it turned out, tanks were a bad choice for the Antarctic terrain and climate. They were too heavy to operate effectively on the snowy ground, and experienced a handful of mechanical complications, including water leaking into the gas tanks and frozen air filters in the engines. Today, the rusting vehicles remain at the site where they were abandoned. Reports vary regarding how many tanks there are, with some claiming that there are 2, while others note that there are 3. There are also conflicting accounts detailing the makes and models of the tanks. All reports seem to agree that at least one of the vehicles is an American-built M2A2 light tank, which debuted in the 1930s and saw limited use in World War II. The tanks were left behind along with a large amount of other equipment in 1941, when the expedition was abruptly ended due to rising international tensions. 4. Desna River Tram. Along a quiet tributary of the Desna River in Ukraine's Kyiv region, there's a dilapidated floating tram covered in chipped red and yellow paint. Perched on a pair of moss-covered pontoons, the conspicuously out-of-place cable car is rumored to belong to a former chief of waterways who bought it as a dasher or vacation home. According to the travel blog Ukraine Trek, the owner found it much easier to buy a structure that was already assembled rather than build his home away from home from scratch. The interior of the car consisted of cabins with beds and a kitchen with a fully functioning refrigerator. It had no engine, but this wasn't a problem. At the time, the Desna River saw a lot of traffic, and passing boats were happy to let the bizarre contraption hitch a ride. One look at the unconventional vehicle is all it takes to realize that it's been abandoned for many years. Photos captured by blogger and photographer Richard Zorge in 2015 show that the inside is in no better shape. Even the least outdoorsy person would likely favor a tent in the woods and a complete lack of modern conveniences over the filthy debris-covered mattresses that look only slightly newer than everything else around them. Sources on the floating tram are scarce and haven't been updated in several years, so there's a good chance that it no longer even exists. If it does, it's probably not only an eyesore, but a safety hazard not worth exploring, although its former owner does deserve some points for creativity. Would you ever repurpose an old train car as a home? Let me know in the comments below, but hit that subscribe button first. 3. The Alpine Funicular Railway. From the early 1900s to the late 1970s, the Alpine Funicular Railway in northern Italy transported tourists between an idyllic lakeshore and a nearby mountaintop, which was home to a variety of restaurants, hotels, and other attractions. At its peak, the railway transported as many as 30,000 people up the mountain every year. It functioned like most other funiculars, with two cars that counterbalance one another on a cable-based system. Each vehicle was permanently attached to one end of the cable, and the two moved in a synchronized fashion. One car ascended while the opposite vehicle went down the mountain, with the latter providing the bulk of the much-needed energy for the former to travel uphill. Today, the defunct funicular stations are eerily silent. A series of photos published by Obsidian Urbex Photography in late 2018 show an aging light blue wooden tram parked on an overgrown track in the upper station, where it's reportedly been sitting for upwards of 3 decades. According to the website, a group of dedicated locals hopes to reopen the funicular someday, but the project has yet to come to fruition due to the high costs of restoring the vehicle to its former glory. 2. Soviet training tank in the German forest. Nicknamed Little Moscow and the Forbidden City, Wunsdorf is a 60,000-acre former military camp that once served as the Red Army's German headquarters. It was home to 75,000 people, including 40,000 Soviet soldiers and their families. The last remaining Russian troops fled the complex in 1994, a few years after the Iron Curtain fell. Given just 12 hours' notice, they left in a hurry, with some even leaving behind their pets and half-eaten lunches. Today, much of Wunsdorf remains intact, albeit in a state of decay. Outside the deserted city in the middle of the forest, there's a rusting contraption that looks like a tank from a distance. Up close, it becomes apparent that the oddly shaped vehicle has no wheels. Even in its decaying state, it's clear that it was never a fully functioning tank. Unlike dummy tanks, which were made from wood and rubber and were meant to deceive the enemy, the bizarre machine is made of metal. It lacks any bullet holes or other signs that it may have been used for target practice. But it does closely resemble a similar tank that was found at another hidden Soviet base in Germany, known as Vogelsang, which was used for training purposes. Known as an Übungspanzer, it appears to be at least somewhat modeled after a Soviet T-54 tank. There's not much left of its interior, but based on appearances, it was once equipped with 2 seats and instruments for loading and aiming the turret. Little is officially known about the practice tank, including how long it's been there, but there's a good chance that it's been rusting away since long before Wunsdorf's abandonment. 1. Vintage Paris subway cars. As recently as 2015, a handful of decaying graffiti-covered vintage subway cars sat mostly undisturbed on a storage track in Paris, save for the occasional urban explorer or spray painter. Located next to the Villiers metro station, the track was formerly used as a roundabout for the city's Metro Line 3 before it was extended years ago. It's clear, based on photos captured by Untapped Cities writer Melanie de Groot van Emden, that the cars were in an advanced state of decay when the pictures were taken. If they're still around and not being cared for, they're presumably in much worse shape by now. Just the same, seeing the old subways would be a rare treat for any train history enthusiast, regardless of their condition. Sadly, like most rapid transit relics, most of the cars were slated for demolition, with the slight possibility that a few were set aside to be restored and preserved. Those that were lucky enough to be saved would eventually be destined for a preservation warehouse in the commune of Villeneuve, which houses a jaw-dropping collection of strikingly pristine vintage metro cars, trolleys, and buses. With vehicles dating as far back as the 1930s, the garage is a subway fanatic's paradise. Unfortunately, it's not open to the public, But once in a blue moon, the city runs some of these nostalgia cars, giving everyday commuters the rare opportunity to step back in time and experience the ride as people would have in decades past. Thanks for watching. Which one of these abandoned vehicles is your favorite and why? Tell us in the comments below and don't forget to subscribe. See you next time. Bye.